Jeremy Fox here with Next Level Psychology. And today we're diving into a topic that most people in my field tend to whisper about, if they even talk about it at all. Okay. So, why psychotherapy fails. And not just that, but why psychotherapy can actually feel a little bit cringe sometimes. Okay. So, I believe in therapy. Obviously, I do. I've seen it, especially evidence based methods like EMDR go very far in helping people completely reach their treatment goals, like overcoming PTSD, including flashbacks and nightmares. Okay. So I'm not saying we throw the baby out of the bathwater, but like any profession, psychotherapy has some blind spots, it has overcorrections and awkward moments. So let's talk about the clinical reality of why psychotherapy can fail. Okay. So, for one thing, the structural and psychological reasons therapy doesn't work includes the mismatch between the therapy model that the counselor is using and the client needs. So, psychotherapy is often built on a diagnostic, symptom focused model. All right, so what does that mean? For many people, especially those that are having existential upheaval, it could feel like being handed a wrench when what you need is a life raft. CBT might not be a good fit for someone who has massive traumatic memory incursions. Okay, so flashbacks. So Bruce Wampold pointed out that common factors like empathy, the therapeutic alliance, and the therapist client relationship, in other words, are more predictive of success than one model. Okay. So Joseph Gahn said that Western therapy fails to address lived realities of people who aren't Western. Okay. So I get that. One thing I'm going to say is a, a lot of graduate programs focus on how to listen, how to hear, and how to reflect back what someone's saying. And I think those are good initial skills, right? That help people to feel heard and understood. But the graduate program is really to weed out bad actors and to determine that people are appropriate to be therapists, I think, versus equipping them with actual empirically valid, powerful modalities, which sadly the therapists have to then pay for out of pocket after the grad program ends. So I use EMDR therapy. So very short primer on that. It is a model that involves desensitizing traumatic memory by having a client either in office, here in my office, or over a computer. Think about the traumatic memory in detail while I move my fingers or have them tap or hold some hand buzzers. So what it does is it stretches out the memory by interfering with it, and it continues to interfere with that memory enough that the brain thinks, oh, well, it's done. It's over now. It's just a memory. So it taxes the working memory of the client by distracting them while thinking of the memory. So that interferes with memory reconciliation, we call it. So what does that do? Well, it takes away flashbacks and nightmares, phobias, OCD intrusions, whatever you want to call it, OCD obsessions. All of that gets positively impacted by EMDR therapy, meaning there's a cessation in flashbacks. Okay. So everybody doesn't learn that. I had to go learn that out in the wild. Okay. In the therapy world, in the training world after I went to graduate school. So that's how that worked. I didn't just learn that in a grad program. I had to go pay for that. So let's keep going. So here's a real hot button one. Therapy doesn't serve men as well as it should. So there's increasing evidence that men benefit less from traditional therapy than women do. It's not due to men being in some way flawed, but it's how we design and deliver therapy work. So many therapy models prioritize emotional expressiveness and vulnerability, which, while vulnerable, don't always align with how many men are socialized to communicate or to even understand their growth. So let's talk about that, right? So men are taught to focus on earning money, manning up, stepping up, and moving forward. So when you teach, this is a fundamental part of psychology, okay? So a fundamental aspect of psychology is if you teach someone something, they tend to go into that and not make exceptions. And so let me explain. So when men are taught to focus on acquisition and performance and putting emotions aside, they practice that. And without practice, you can't easily switch into a behavior. So it's hard to state switch when you weren't taught something. So it's like saying, "Oh, I'm going to go ride my bike." Okay, if you ride a bike, you've learned how to do that, right? Like no one says, "I'm going to go ride my bike," and they've never ridden a bike before because you're going to fall over. However, when men are told, "You're going to do therapy now," okay? And they're expected to go emote, that's like expecting someone to go ride a bike who's never done it before. They're going to fall over, they're going to be suspicious, they're going to feel embarrassed because they haven't practiced that, right? Same principle that you have to practice the behavior to be quickly good at it. So I see a lot of articles about men now falling behind the workplace, and that's frustrating women who would want to marry them, right? Because they want the guy to do well. So all of the stuff about male socialization is to say they're not socialized to speak the same way in therapy that has now become the norm. Okay. And that's just how it is. It's not, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, a good thing, or whatever. But if you want more information on it, it's just a fact. Okay. So I have a lot of male clients, right? And because I do, I learn what they're looking for and what they're not. And you're usually looking for ways to overcome crippling self-doubt and trauma and intrusive memories and thoughts by themselves interfere with their work and or relationship functioning. There's nothing wrong with that. Those are valid therapy goals, by the way, because psychopathological conditions typically involve impact upon work, upon school, or upon relationships, or all three. So if you're sidelined by PTSD and you can't work like you did, that is a diagnostic point. So men have a lot they could benefit from in therapy, and even the diagnostic system set up that speaks to their issues, but they don't want to go in there and emotionally reveal right away because it's not going to work for them in their life the same way it does for women typically. That's just reality. So John Barry and colleagues in 2016 found that gender differences in therapeutic outcomes suggest men often feel alienated and misunderstood in therapy settings. So Barry, who I've spoken to, by the way, he's a really awesome psychologist. Barry argues for strengths-based approaches that are more goal-oriented, action focused, okay, and aligned with how many men conceptualize health. Okay. So goal, action, alignment. Nothing wrong with that. By the way, a lot of women want that in therapy too. Can I just be honest? A lot of women want to feel that their therapy really speaks to what quantifiable, documentable changes they want to see in their lives. I'll give you a little secret here. A lot of the complaints about therapy are very valid because it's lazy therapy. You go in and somebody says, "How are you this week?" Blah, blah, blah. That's lazy therapy. So, real therapy focuses on an overarching goal, okay, like I want to stop experiencing flashbacks, and objectives for that goal, like I will confront my PTSD through EMDR therapy weekly with my counselor, blah blah whatever, and then the actual, or it would be I will confront PTSD. Okay, that's it, and then the methodology, the intervention will be EMDR therapy weekly. Do you see how that goes? You've got a goal, an objective, and an intervention. Okay, and each one gets more specific. That's therapy. If that doesn't sound familiar to you, but you've had therapy, well, then perhaps the therapist was kind of riffing a little bit and taking it less goal oriented approach. But in trauma work, which is what I do, quite a few people really want to get into the quantifiable empirical methods that reduce something, right? It's either reduced, it's the same, or it's worse. That's how traumatic flashbacks go. So people don't want to play around and do how do you feel this week therapy when they're in the midst of overcoming trauma. I'm sorry. A lot of them don't want to do that. So I'm used to delivering therapy that's, again, action and goal oriented for women and men. Okay, let's keep going. The over pathologizing of normal human pain is a big problem in our world today. Abigail Shrier's book, Bad Therapy, talks about this. So here's what we've covered so far. We've got mismatch between a model and a need. Okay. We've got therapy not serving men that well. We've got over pathologizing of normal human pain next. Okay. That's where we are. So not everything's trauma. Fun fact. Not every feeling that is aversive points to a disorder. Okay. Sometimes you're sad because something legitimately is difficult, and it's not because you have clinical weapons grade depression, okay? But we validate, we label, we overdiagnose. So that actually sends people the message that they're not that resilient. So Alan Francis in 2013, who's a psychiatrist, he warned in his book Saving Normal that over medicalizing ordinary emotions is risky. Barbara Ehrenreich, I think I'm pronouncing that right, in 2009 critiqued the culture of forced positivity in her book Bright-Sided. Okay, so what does that say? Okay, so if you have questions about that or thoughts, put them in the chat. But I'm going to say also, there's another principle at work here called prevalence inflation, and you can look that up. When these massive mental health campaigns are launched in the UK and the US primarily, and it says, oh, if you have these symptoms, go get checked. You may have a mental illness, right? A mental health condition or a mental illness. And people go and they over pathologize and look into themselves and flip out and think that normal sadness is depression, normal anxiety is generalized anxiety disorder. So, okay, again, prevalence inflation hypothesis, check it out. Okay, so let's keep going. So we've got the therapy that prioritizes insight without action. Now, this is big, okay? This might be one of the bigger ones that I've noticed, and I kind of spoiled it going into the conversation here, okay? So you could spend years excavating the psychological architecture and foundation of your childhood and still be stuck in the same patterns, the same relationships, even the same job or marriage when it's not working for you or is abusive in some way, okay? So what does that mean? Understanding the problem does not always change the outcome. Full stop. I have to tell you that, okay? So Prochaska and DiClemente, who are the Stages of Change authors, they have a trans theoretical model that reminds us that readiness and behavior change require more than reflection. Okay, that's a mouthful. I know it. But there is no substitute, okay, for change, no matter how small it starts. I'm just going to say it that way. So if you look, because that's accurate, if you look at behavioral activation therapy, BAT, the goal is to get moving, become active with behavior. Small changes add up. Small changes are worth a day of thoughts. They really are, because don't count for what they don't count. They're not real. They're real in how they can affect your behavior and your mood, of course, but they don't add up to anything of change in your life. And that's what people want in therapy. So understanding the problem doesn't always change the outcome. I love that. That's what you need to keep in mind. So Marsha Linehan, the guru, and absolute, she would hate being called that, the absolute queen of modern mindfulness, of dialectical behavior therapy herself, focused her work on the need for skills training. So she pioneered a lot of skills training. Insight's great. It's the beginning. Okay? That's all it is. You cannot have an aha moment that doesn't get transformed into legitimate change. It doesn't do anything. Okay. So therapist passivity, that's a reason that therapy fails. Okay. We're really getting here. We've got our fifth reason here. So many therapists are afraid to rupture the alliance with the client. They sit back, validate, nod, reflect, but sometimes the work requires confrontation and the gentle but firm kind of pointing out discrepancies, we call it. All right. So without any kind of challenge like that, there's no transformation. So Kiesler and Greenberg in their research both argue that therapeutic change is driven by emotional activation. And okay, so I just talked about activation. So relational dynamism, not endless empathy. So emotional activation, meaning you're in the moment and you're connected. It could be you're connected to a sense of unease because you're noticing a discrepancy between what you're saying you want and what you're actually doing, what you're striving toward, okay? And then also relational dynamism. So that relationship with the therapist is in real time changing to meet your goals and what you need and to point you toward that, not to say, oh, yeah, whatever you say. So the sixth reason therapy might not be working: outdated or rigid models. So some therapists are still using interventions that are somewhat outdated or unhelpful. So with no ongoing education, okay? So that would really be called malpractice in other fields. Noah Cross and Wampold call for evidence-based relationships, not just evidence-based techniques. I like that idea. I'm going to investigate that more. But evidence-based therapeutic relationships and what it does, right? So we just talked about that ability to confront. That's what we're talking about. So Vanderkolk reminds us that unprocessed trauma is a key element that underlies quite a bit of pathology. And that's just ignored by a lot of talk therapy models that just say focus up here and not in the body, focus on the mind and not the body. But therapist burnout, that could be a seventh reason therapy doesn't work. And that's sad because that's an ethical thing, but it's also very understandable. So the mental health care system is not great with pay in many positions. If you're working for a mental health agency, that's very predatory and emotionally taxing on you, then you're going to get disengaged, right? So if you have 8 clients a day for 4 days a week and then 7 or 5 on one day, like between 5 and 7, I mean, that's a lot. Okay. Just be aware you're really working yourself here and you're being worked to a high degree there. You have to be aware is your what's filling your cup, okay? That's huge. You cannot continue to do this work if you don't have the ability to say, I'm leaving this trauma that I'm working with through my clients at work. And I'm not going to take it home, okay? I'm not going to let it impact my own time that I need to recharge myself. So, low pay, high caseloads, emotional labor, and we're talking real emotional labor here, lead to disengagement of therapists. So, again, you have to be able to do things that fill your cup. So disengaged therapists do real harm. I like the definition for Maslach and others. That's just how it's quoted at all. Define burnout as emotional exhaustion and depersonalization. Yeah, so that emotional exhaustion component and feeling disconnected from yourself and what's going on in the moment, like those are key elements of burnout. And burnout involves not being there. And what's interesting is that relational dynamism and your connection with the client is what's going to flounder. It's not going to be there, and you're not going to think to use the right kind of interventions or models. Okay, so we could also refer to it as compassion fatigue. All right, so let's talk about sort of the cringe model here, of therapy. What causes it to be cringe? Okay, so what causes therapy to result in an eye roll and a sigh versus like an aha, right? So therapy speak, when saying something like "I'm holding space," inner child, whatever, those concepts are useful, but the language might sound very foreign and it might sound somewhat disconnected to a lot of clients, especially men, by the way, to loop it back to that point. So Carl Rogers advocated for plain, honest speech. Carl Rogers, the dude who did person-centered therapy, okay, used to be called client-centered. So we don't have to use terms that are oblique or confusing or obscure in some way. So the advent of social media therapy. All right, so therapy language often gets turned into memes. It gets memeified. So gaslighting, trauma bonding, boundaries. Those are important ideas, but those ideas become tools for self-diagnosis for people and buzzwords, hashtags, and tags to find online, right? Keywords to search rather than just growth. And so everyone's not a narcissist. Everyone's not gaslighting you. Everyone's not trauma bonding with you. Some people are, but it's all about context. And we can't know that if we're following a lot of social media therapy buzzwords and content that is purposefully upsetting because it gets high in the algorithm that way. Okay. So self help culture can turn therapy into a bit of a performance. And that's something to keep in mind. It's not therapy if it's not personalized, it's just self help. And beware, how are you applying it to yourself? So over validation is also a problem in the therapy world. I'm going to say it. Okay. So therapists sometimes confuse validation with endorsement. You can tell someone you're valid, right? After they behave in a way that is just human. So blaming someone else for choices, but that's cheerleading. That's not actual behavioral change or exploration. You're just saying, all right, they're there. So Jonathan Haidt, who you may know from my previous streams, one of which was Dobransky. Jonathan Haidt wrote The Anxious Generation, and Brene Brown wrote The Gift of Imperfection. She wrote many different books. She's big on overcoming shame. So Jonathan Haidt and Brene Brown both stress that growth comes from both vulnerability and accountability. Okay, those two things together, not just comfort. Remember the phrase comfort zone. What are we doing when we clutch to comfort rather than moving out from that? I think we're at a boiling point here of protective Gen X parents who don't want to replicate the mistakes of earlier, more brusque, and we could say blunt generations that would say, suck it up or I'll give you something to cry about, right? Gen X doesn't want to replicate that, neither do millennials. But they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater because Gen Z and Gen Alpha need to learn everything isn't a crisis. Remember that fact that those of you who are parents, that when a child skins their knee and you look at them and you flip out, they cry. But if you don't and you say it's going to be okay, they're less likely to cry. That sort of modeling That mirroring, we call it in the psychoanalytic world, determines how kids react to emotional issues in the present and future, by the way. If everything is validated as okay that they do, they're going to learn hurting other people isn't a big deal. Or if everything is a crisis, including going out somewhere, staying over, like at a friend's house, making less than an A, they're going to be neurotic. So what you have to do, and that's not one mistake, it's not one single thing either. It's going to be a pattern, okay? So we don't want to over validate. We don't want to leave people where they are, but we want them to know they matter. I also love that it's vulnerability and accountability together, okay? You need vulnerability and you need accountability to grow. So I don't care who you're being vulnerable with. I don't advise men who are with people of a mixed company that they don't trust to get vulnerable. That's not what that means. It means have a therapist or a mentor who can know your blind spots to help you navigate them. We've ruined that word vulnerability and turned it into basically emoting everything and telling everything about yourself. However, any hero's journey is going to include elements where you see behind the hero's confidence and you see him have a moment of reaching his limits. That's vulnerability when you acknowledge it. And then you have the mentor figure that helps you, that gives you the weapon or the insight, or like the Force with Luke Skywalker. He needed to have that mentor figure, Obi-Wan, who knew that Luke's father was at that time, he thought that he didn't have a father. He passed away, right? So Luke had this orphan mentality. He was vulnerable to this mentor figure who taught him, you need to use the Force. You have more power than you know. Okay, that's vulnerability. What's accountability? Luke had to go out and, within one movie, taking out the Death Star, going from the farm boy on Tatooine to taking out the Death Star, that's a lot of growth, right? Like, and if he had just said, you know what, this isn't my problem, and this princess who needs Obi-Wan Kenobi, I don't care. Like, I don't care that I got a hologram here from her on my R2D2. Like, it just doesn't matter. I don't want to deal with this. I don't have any parents and I'm going to live my life. Like, he didn't do that. So there's my off the cuff Luke Skywalker vulnerability accountability example. There you go. You're welcome. So, okay, let's keep going. So we've said, I want to recap this. We have the reason that therapy gets cringe is therapy speak, social media therapy, over validation. Okay, let's keep going. Now, this one's kind of related. So TikTok has given us therapists lip syncing about attachment theory, okay, and all of that stuff. Neat. Some of that is great education, but the medium starts to warp the message sometimes. It just happens. So Sherry Turkle notes that parasocial dynamics can erode relational integrity. Wow, that's a mouthful. Okay. And by the way, Sherry Turkle is a good theorist about online mental health sorts of phenomena. So Sherry Turkle, it's funny because it all aligns here. She is a sociologist and she looks at the impact of computer engagement. We could call it digital engagement. She did a book in 1984 called The Second Self. About computers. She has been doing this stuff for years. So I was in a little online book study that looked at her stuff a few months ago. So it's funny, in my research for today's podcast, wonderful, right? I get a quote from her, and I love working with her materials. Again, it's not a quote; it's just her point. Parasocial dynamics erode relational integrity. All right. So a parasocial relationship, just to let everybody know, if you don't know that term, okay, it's a one-way relationship where someone is watching an influencer or some other figure like TV. TV was the first thing. Really. You could even see say radio probably. I'm not that old. Anyway, the internet though, with parasocial relationships, has become more interesting than ever because you've got people who make videos in real time and stream like what I'm doing. So they stream, they can answer questions, they can kind of be a part of your life, but you're still more watching them, and it's one way because you're more connected to them. They don't know about you, but you may be projecting onto them that they know your likes, that you have things in common, and they are your friend and like you. Like it's basically a function of transference of your fond feelings onto this other person. Okay, so think about it that way. So when you have influencer therapists, it's a bit interesting because they're not your therapist. They're, no matter how awesome they feel, they aren't. They are a source of information. So Jonathan Haidt critiques the broader cultural push to avoid discomfort. So that's a thing that's happening with some influencers that are therapists. I mean, so that just sells, right? Fear and reducing fear both sell pretty well if you think about it. So, all right, let's say therapy is as identity. This is probably my favorite reason that therapy is a bit cringe because I actually like to shock people with this one. So, we all know someone who's made healing or being healed their entire personality, right? Therapy becomes not a tool for change, but that's their aesthetic. Okay. It replaces growth with performative growth, performative references to whatever healing they're doing. I mean, even Foucault, the French philosopher, he wrote about this in Technologies of the Self. Okay. Christopher Lasch saw it coming in the culture of narcissism. So, this idea of therapy as identity, I'm going to explore this more an upcoming essay. But for right now, I would say what you need to keep in mind is when someone constantly talks about their flaws and their efforts at overcoming them, it's a bit too meta. And in other words, it's a bit too talking about the self. And there's people who do this in a very fragile, narcissistic way to constantly grip the conversation and have it be about them, even if it's negatively about them. So there's a lot to be seen there and a lot to be discussed in terms of that. I mean, I have clients who've gone to therapy for years and years, and they come to me and I tell them the goal is that you don't need therapy anymore. And everything doesn't have to be talked to death. You need action. You need to have identity and hobbies apart from that. Like for me, I really love talking about music, movies, especially ones that are, that really traffic in the gritty themes of the human condition. So I like to shock people. Like, can a therapist be someone who goes to a rock concert and watches horror movies and braves the grittiness of terror in the human condition and enjoys talking about it? Yes. A therapist doesn't have to be a boring person. A therapist has to be less themselves in what they talk about in session with you. But they do not have to be personality less. They cannot be to an extent. Because in Freudian psychoanalysis, the therapist needs to be minimal in their presentation, but they still are going to be a presence in some way that thinks of what to pick up on. And what you think to pick up and run with as a therapist depends on your training and your personality. There's no way to outrun personality and intellect in therapy because Freud invented, obviously, and he got from other forerunners too, but he systematized the talking cure, as we know. So Freud would engage in the free association technique of having a client sit on the couch, say what comes to mind. But after that, right, when you systematize that and you see what the client's neuroses are and you choose what to pick up on, your brain, your points of reference, your background in metaphor, all of that is going to come to mind when you assess and essentially create the client's clinical portrait. When you create their assessment and when you case conceptualize, you're bringing yourself into that, right? Even when you use a diagnostic manual. So if the therapist only has this personality and you could tell all they do is talk about, give yourself a cup of water and self care all day, people don't really want to idealize that. So, a fun fact about therapy with narcissistic personality disorder is a psychoanalytic approach to that is you have the client idealize you and then you break that idealization and you have them start to do the work of recognizing that they can respect someone without fully idealizing them. And so basically, you have to be very aware of how you come across to your clients in that model, and you have to be dynamic. So, therapist as dynamic individual has really been left by the wayside. And I'm going to be controversial and say I think that a lot of clients don't want to go to someone that they wouldn't respect, that they wouldn't think is worth a cup of coffee with. So, I mean, that's just from my exploration with clients and from hearing like oh, my last therapist was a nice person, but they didn't um they didn't really tell me anything to do. They just said that my thoughts were valid and that they listened to me. Well, so that's actually not therapy, and I understand why people would want that, and I understand why therapists will get sloppy and do it, but it's not really an excuse. You need to get into like a therapy book club or study that allows you to reclaim the flame of your clinical passion, to discover what is it that I need to connect to be a better diagnostician, to be a better clinical assessor in some way, or a better clinical presence for healing that uses a more effective model. What can I do to have a technology of healing like EMDR therapy, like even behavioral activation therapy to chart out the changes that a client wants to make and to be more effective? We all have to do that. Let's do a positive twist here, a positive spin and conclusion. So, all right. So, how about when therapy works? Let's talk about it. Okay. Thank you. Yes. All right. So, first, safety, clarity, and attunement. Okay. Those three things together are important to therapy. The therapeutic alliance is the treatment. That's what has been proffered. It's what has been stated by many different researchers. And well, why is that? Because different modalities have been tested and clients have recovered under many different mental health approaches, okay? From CBT to EMDR to whatever, to existential. So it's actually called the dodo bird effect, like the dodo bird from back in the day. So it's the effect that therapists of different schools of thought produce the same effectiveness. Okay, everybody wins essentially. Um, it's a very interesting thing because it comes from the dodo bird story in Alice in Wonderlands. A number of characters become wet, and in order to dry themselves, everyone runs around the lake until they're dry. Nobody cared to measure how far each person had run nor how long. When they asked the dodo who had won, he thought long and hard and said, "Everybody has won and all must have prizes." Okay, so I love that. I think that is an awesome story to have as that, as it's because it's a weird name, the dodo bird effect. But hey, now you'll remember it. So I've made conjecture on that. It's good to see someone say here that they recovered with EMDR. Well, okay, I'm biased. I would say EMDR therapy is uniquely effective because it takes the scaling of cognitive behavior therapy, the scaling questions of 0 to 10. It takes the desensitization and exposure of behavioral therapy, the B in CBT, and it's very client centered because you're desensitizing in the session and taking pauses and asking, okay, take a breath. What are you noticing of the client, right? So it's an omni-therapy, really, an omni-therapy. It encompasses quite a lot. I'm never going to go back to therapy without EMDR as part of my toolbox. And listen, I tell clients now, hey, I might be the therapist for you if you want something that addresses your key negative core memories. If you don't want that, if you don't want to address things with desensitization exposure, I might not be the therapist for you, especially if you want to use insurance, but we're not following anything that insurance would say is a goal, right? Like or a diagnosable condition. So because I don't want to get into ethical hot water with that. But if people want therapy with me, it's often going to be, didn't mean to rhyme that, EMDR. That's just what I'm passionate about. And of course it can be talk. It can be talk a lot of the time, but I want there to also be the desensitization element because that's what I know is going to work. I've seen it enough, I've read enough research. So those two things, anecdotal and empirical together. Okay. And that's really the sweet spot. If you want to know what we therapists value, we value anecdotal research and evidence from our own work, and we value empirical evidence, meaning aggregated studies that show something works. And so both of those together can be very powerful. Okay, so enough about that. We explored that a little bit. So let's say, so first it's that the relationship that heals. That's what Irv Yalom said. Irvin Yalom is a titan in the group therapy field and the therapy world in general. He was just one of the greats. As far as I'm aware, he's still alive. He's been practicing for decades. So okay, second, we need to balance insight with execution. So clients need both understanding and tools, nervous system literacy, boundaries, decision making. These are teachable skills. Yay. So Dan Siegel and Stephen Porges both illuminate how embodied regulation underpins all meaningful change. Okay, so that's a mouthful. So embodied therapeutic methods, again, like Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory and Dan Siegel's interpersonal neurobiology, those things of experiencing the anxiety or the feelings, but feeling witnessed by the therapist, safe in the room, that underpins change. We cannot have it without that, in my opinion. Third, therapists remaining humble. That's an element of change. Okay. The best therapists are learners. They update the frameworks, they ask better questions, and they're not afraid to say, I don't know. So, relational attunement and mutual influence are more important than therapist as expert. Okay. So it's important to keep that in mind. Being attuned to the relationship. All right. Fourth, when we speak like people and not robots. Okay. So it's time to drop the mysticism. If a client leaves session more confused than when they arrived, something went wrong. And I will say that too. When clients don't understand what we're doing, when they don't feel they got anything out of it, they'll just usually go along with it until they leave. They don't often confront us. I've had many clients come to me and say, I don't really know what was happening. They were nice. It's like, no, that's not great. It's your money or your insurance policy's money, which you pay for your insurance, so it's still your money. So let's talk to clients with their language and explain what internal family systems is. But the exile part is, oh, it's the inner child that you're ashamed of. It's not that difficult. Matulsky and Varine in 2020 call clear, respectful listening the radical act. We don't need to sound profound. We need to be real. Authenticity. Okay. Really something that I would say is important, no pun intended with the word real. So we really have to be aware. What are we bringing into the room? And you need to be aware as clients. What is it that I'm looking for right now in a session from a counselor? What is it fair to expect? Okay? It's fair to expect someone who is educated, ethical, empirical. Okay? I was trying to make it three E's there. So you need someone who is able to serve your needs. And that means if you've been through trauma, guess what? Maybe they need to have an EMDR background or a trauma focused CBT background. Those might be necessary. You might need a model that's more geared toward flashbacks, nightmares, reliving symptoms, nervous system hyperarousal of the sympathetic branch of the nervous system. You need that. You don't need, let's have a cup of tea, talk about the weather, talk about, have you tried thinking differently? No, no, no. And yes, you probably have tried thinking differently. But if you're reliving trauma, your nervous system needs the therapy. You need someone with post master's or post doctoral trauma therapy treatment. Please remember that. Okay. So you need a match in the method and in the therapist's personality. That's what you need. And you deserve that as a patient. Your needs matter. So psychotherapy is not broken. I don't want us to think that it is, but it's fallible. So when therapy's bad, it can not only be ineffective or frustrating, but it actually can be damaging. I just want people to know that. Bad therapy is often worse than no therapy. That's a huge motto of mine. Because think about it. If you're a child and you watch a horror movie and you see a horrifying scene and it replays in your mind for years, you've been affected worse than if you'd seen nothing. If you go to therapy and something sticks in your mind that was abusive or upsetting or unsettling in a way about your psyche or that makes you think poorer, that's worse than no therapy. Okay? So when therapy's really bad, it's even cringe. Like, let's go sit down and you just need a bubble bath and some ice cream. No, that's not therapy. That's called a you got this girl, go girl moment. Like that's an atta girl. That's not therapy, right? That's a TikTok that you watch. So when therapy's good though, it's authentic. And I'm going to reiterate again, it's safe, clear, and attuned to you, and it fits with what your clinical diagnosis and needs are. So by the way, be open to what your diagnosis could be. So if you've had trauma and you know it, great. Not great that you had trauma, great that you know it. If you don't know what trauma really is, or you think it's only wartime stuff or being mugged, be open to the fact that if you were scared for your life a lot as a kid, you might have had trauma. Okay? That might be what you're dealing with versus, standard run of the mill anxiety. That's how I would put it. So be open to what it looks like to that if you had a traumatic experience, receive trauma treatment. Okay, trauma is not just what veterans experience, and I really want people to know, like, your experiences here may meet a different diagnostic criteria than what you were thinking. You might have been told you have bipolar disorder, right? when you have quickly shifting moods, well, maybe it's borderline personality disorder. Not saying it is, but people misdiagnose and self-diagnose because of cultural terms that we use all the time. It's so common that people get in their head these terms that are inaccurate. Well, why is that? Again, let's go back to it. Therapy speak, entering the public sphere. Okay, so that's what I've got. Really appreciate everyone's time here. If you want to help me out with the channel, I call it that, like YouTube. Please don't hesitate to reach out. My DMs are open. You can send me podcast ideas. So I'm now podcasting from the Substack app here because it can save as that. So if you have topics that you want me to talk about, I would love you to submit them. You can put them in the chat here while I'm here. I check the DMs. Happy for collaborations with other professionals. It's always fun to talk on something and bring some light to it when it's like a myth. So like the myth of therapy is all therapists are the same. They're not. They're not all trained the same. Some are more trained in cognitive behavior therapy. Some are more trained in trauma work, like me, that I've gotten after the fact, after I graduated. So that's a myth that you just go to any therapist and they're all going to help you the same way. Wrong. So one of my favorite things to do is to talk about mental health myths. So if you have some of those or you have questions and you wonder if it's a myth or fact, and you want to ask a question about whatever your thought is, send it to me. Okay, so thank you so much, and I look forward to you all joining me later, and I really appreciate it. I would not be able to do this without an audience, and I hope to see you all out there.